Before the blade ever kissed the neck of Charles, before the scaffold soaked in the blood of monarchy, there was a girl, 15 years old, French by birth, Catholic by conviction, and alone the moment she stepped ashore on English soil. She came not with soldiers, not with glory, not with threats, but with silk lace, a crown too large for her head, and eyes that had already learned the art of watching without blinking. Her name was Henrietta Maria of France, and though history would write volumes about the king she married, it would take centuries to notice that the road to civil war began with her silent arrival in 1625. She was born into a world already stained with blood. Her father, Henry IV, had been assassinated by a religious fanatic when she was still in the cradle. Her mother, Marie de Medici, clung to court politics like a drowning woman to driftwood, raising Henrietta with the stiff posture of someone who understood that queens are made in silence and survival. Henrietta was the youngest and perhaps the most delicate, but she was also the most observant. In the palaces of the French Bourbon, she learned early that affection was political, that marriage was a treaty dressed in lace, and that women were most powerful when underestimated. When her marriage was arranged to Charles, newly crowned King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, it was not love that sailed her across the English Channel. It was strategy. England needed an ally, France needed influence, and Henrietta Maria, aged 15, became the living embodiment of a fragile hope, that two countries could trust each other long enough to stay out of war. But England did not open its arms to her. The English people saw not a queen but a threat. Her religion alone made her suspect. A Catholic queen in a Protestant land was already scandalous. But a French Catholic queen was a symbol of everything the Puritans feared and the Parliament loathed. She hadn't spoken a word yet, and they were already cursing her name in the streets. Charles, for his part, was as uncertain a husband as he was a king. He was reserved, soft-spoken, rigid in belief but awkward in emotion. He greeted his young bride with formal courtesy but not warmth. The language barrier between them was real, but so was the emotional wall Charles had built since childhood. He had never expected to marry Henrietta. She had been a substitute bride after the failed Spanish match. Now she was his queen, standing in the shadows of Whitehall Palace, surrounded by her French attendants, clutching rosary beads while English courtiers whispered behind tapestries. Henrietta's early years in England were a storm without thunder. The hostility was quiet but constant. She was mocked for her accent, shunned at court, and accused, without evidence, of meddling in state affairs. Her own attendants were dismissed by Charles after a series of petty squabbles, leaving her isolated in a palace she did not yet understand. Yet she endured, and in the solitude of her chapel, beneath the whispered prayers of a faith that had become treasonous in her new kingdom, she began to reshape her role, not as a victim, but as a force. At first, she found refuge in the familiar rhythms of Catholic liturgy, the smell of incense in the private chapels built for her, and the letters she wrote back to France in secret. But over time, something in her changed. Henrietta had been sent to England to serve a purpose, but now she began to question her own fate. If she was to be queen, she would not be a silent one. She learned English quickly, sharpened her intellect through political observation, and discovered the subtle art of reading her husband's silences. And when she finally began to speak, it was not as a foreign girl, but as a woman who understood power. The relationship between Charles and Henrietta grew not from passion, but from necessity. Both were solitary, both were devout, both misunderstood. As political tensions with Parliament escalated, Charles found in Henrietta a confidant, someone who would never question his divine right to rule. She, in turn, found in him a man who, though flawed and proud, was loyal, constant, and above all hers. Their marriage matured into something few expected, a genuine alliance of hearts and strategy. But while their love grew in private, hatred brewed in public. England was not at peace. The king's refusal to call Parliament, his stubborn insistence on the divine right of kings, and the enforcement of controversial taxes stirred unrest. Henrietta was seen as his dark angel, whispering in his ear, encouraging his pride, guiding his policies toward absolutism. Pamphlets painted her as a scheming Jezebel. Ministers accused her of poisoning the king's mind. Even the presence of her private Catholic chapel within the royal palace became a symbol of royal corruption and popish threat. Every candle lit for her prayers cast shadows over her husband's legitimacy. And yet she remained. When others fled the storm of politics, Henrietta moved toward it. She began to attend court with renewed elegance, hosting musical events and literary salons that not only displayed royal grandeur, but served as subtle tools of diplomacy. Ambassadors, nobles, even opponents were drawn into her circle, seduced not by politics, but by performance. She was building influence not through force, but through presence. The birth of her children gave her new stature. First a daughter, then a son, Charles James, the future Charles II. Motherhood made her more sympathetic in some eyes, though never beloved. To many she was still the Catholic interloper. But within the palace walls, her role solidified. She was no longer the frightened girl from Paris. She was now the Queen of England, and her children were heirs to 3 kingdoms. Still, the shadows lengthened. England was changing, and so was Charles. The king's grip on authority tightened, and as he grew more isolated from Parliament, he turned increasingly to Henrietta for advice. Some historians would later argue that she became his most dangerous influence. Others would say she was his only remaining ally. Perhaps both were true. What is certain is that her presence in his life became inextricable from his decisions. As tensions with Parliament escalated, Henrietta stood by her husband, whispering words of steel into the heart of a man slowly being encircled. And in this entanglement of love and loyalty, of faith and defiance, Henrietta Maria began to shape not only a marriage, but a national crisis. What the people saw was a queen holding her husband's hand as he defied his subjects. What they didn't see, couldn't see, was the fear behind her eyes. She knew what it meant to grow up in a country where kings died on the steps of carriages. She had seen blood on royal silk before, and she sensed even then that England's patience had a price. It would not be long before that price would be paid. But as part 1 closes, the world still turns, the king still reigns, and the queen still walks the candlelit halls of Whitehall with a purpose no one quite understands. Not yet. But history would. The crown did not crack in a single moment. It splintered quietly, along the ridges of pride, across the chasms of religion, and under the weight of a monarchy that no longer understood the soil beneath it. While the commoners argued over bread and the nobles debated over liberties, a queen in white lace moved behind the scenes, invisible to most but vital to the one man still clinging to the throne. Henrietta Maria, once the exiled girl in her own court, was no longer watching from the shadows. She had become the voice in the storm, and her influence would soon seep into every crevice of England's unraveling. Charles had ruled without Parliament for 11 years, an era historians would call the personal rule. But to the people it was something colder, rule by decree, rule without consent. While many blamed the king's rigid personality, others looked past the crown and pointed to the queen, the French Catholic, the foreign wife, the woman whose religion seemed to mirror tyranny itself. The marriage that once seemed politically clever had become a cultural fault line. And yet inside the palace, the 2 monarchs drew closer than ever. It was in those years of relative calm only on the surface, that Henrietta Maria's political instincts matured into something more assertive, more precise. She began reading dispatches with the attention of a minister and attending council briefings not just as a queen, but as an operator. Charles, who never fully trusted most of his nobles, turned more often to his wife. She spoke with clarity, without flattery, and never questioned his divine right. She didn't need to. She believed in it. What formed between them during this period was more than love. It was ideological fusion. Charles believed himself chosen by God. Henrietta believed it too, and more dangerously believed she was chosen to protect that destiny. The weight of royal blood was not foreign to her. She carried Bourbon pride in her spine and the scars of her father's assassination in her breath. If power required sharpness, she would wield it. If survival required manipulation, she would embrace it. But England was changing. The religious undercurrent that had long been bubbling finally breached the surface. Charles's insistence on uniformity in the Church of England, particularly in Scotland, ignited backlash. His imposition of the Book of Common Prayer meant to unify worship, only inflamed division. The Scots resisted fiercely, launching the bishops' wars, conflicts that not only drained the royal coffers, but exposed the king's vulnerability. Henrietta watched her husband pour resources into suppressing rebellion, while whispers of parliamentary power grew louder in Westminster. To many, the queen was not merely a consort, but a conspirator. Rumors painted her as the hidden architect of Charles's arrogance, the echo chamber for his worst decisions. Pamphlets, some printed in secret basements, others brazenly distributed in the streets, depicted her as a serpent coiled around the throne. Every Catholic ambassador she hosted, every mass held in her private chapel, became a symbol of impending betrayal. It didn't matter that she had no official position. Her influence was visible enough to provoke fear. And yet the queen did not retreat. In fact, she leaned in. Her salons became diplomatic arenas. French envoys, Irish nobles, and English royalists found in her a center of gravity. She began shaping not just conversations, but coalitions. She advised Charles on appointments, policies, and tone. She encouraged him to assert royal authority, to deny Parliament the right to question the will of a divinely anointed monarch. She reminded him that to compromise with those who rejected his kingship was to diminish the very essence of the crown. Their children grew during this time, mostly within the safety of palaces, but not untouched by the political weight that surrounded their family. Henrietta raised them with both tenderness and calculation. Her sons would be future kings, her daughters would be political bridges. She taught them not merely courtly manners, but how to endure public disdain with a straight spine. Even in moments of maternal warmth, the queen never forgot the stage they were on. There was no private life anymore. Every lullaby was a lesson. Every prayer a strategy, but no amount of pageantry or portraiture could disguise the deepening fracture between the monarchy and its people. When Charles finally recalled Parliament in 1640, forced by the financial strain of war and rebellion, it was not a moment of reconciliation. It was an ambush. Parliament, long excluded, returned not with deference but with demands. They wanted reform, accountability, and most of all, limits on royal power. Charles, pushed by pride and reinforced by Henrietta's counsel, resisted. He believed Parliament was a servant, not a partner. He had not yet grasped that the balance of power had shifted under his feet. Henrietta saw it sooner than he did. In private, she urged action. She saw the rising tide of Puritanism, the thirst for vengeance among the commons, the religious fury aimed directly at her family. She encouraged her husband to stand firm, to dissolve Parliament again if needed, to crush rebellion before it metastasized. But Charles hesitated. His delay became disaster. The turning point came when Charles, against the advice of even his closest supporters, attempted to arrest 5 members of Parliament directly in the House of Commons. The act, unprecedented and illegal, sent shockwaves through London. The members escaped before he arrived, forewarned and now mythologized as heroes. Charles entered the chamber only to find empty seats and a cold silence. The message was clear. The king no longer ruled uncontested. Henrietta was furious, not because the plan failed, but because it had been executed with hesitation and without full resolve. She knew now that the crown had enemies, not just in Parliament, but in the streets, in pulpits, in print shops, and even in court, and she knew that the time for subtlety had passed. The months that followed were a blur of rising tempers and mobilizing militias. England stood at the edge of civil war. Lines were drawn not just on maps, but in families. Brothers stood on opposing sides. Churches split. Neighborhoods turned cold. And within the palace, Charles and Henrietta faced the terrifying realization that the very people they were born to rule no longer saw them as necessary. It was during these final months before the outbreak of full war that Henrietta made her most fateful decision. She would leave England, not to escape, but to gather support. She would sail to the continent, raise funds, secure weapons, and return not as a queen hoping for peace, but as one preparing for battle. She left behind her husband, her children, in the familiar corridors of Whitehall to become a monarch in exile. She boarded the ship not as a fugitive, but as a strategist. She wore armor beneath silk. She whispered prayers not of humility, but of resolve. And as England descended into civil war, her absence became a presence in itself. Pamphleteers warned of her return as if of an invasion. Parliament accused her of treason. Her name became a war cry, both feared and cursed. She was no longer merely Charles's queen. She had become, in the minds of many, the queen of division. But for Henrietta Maria, there was no turning back. She believed in the crown because she believed in the divine. She believed in Charles because she believed in duty. And even as ships rocked beneath her feet and war clouds darkened over the three kingdoms, she still believed there was a future to save. That belief would carry her into exile, but it would not protect her from what was coming. The crown was no longer divided, it was fractured, and pieces were beginning to fall. There are moments in history when a nation no longer argues, but ignites. England in 1642 was no longer a land of debates and decrees. It was a tinderbox, and the spark had already been struck. Parliament had armed itself. The king had raised his standard. And, from the shores of the Dutch Republic, Henrietta Maria watched her husband's kingdom tear itself apart like a house of stained glass, shattered by the very light it once reflected. Her departure from England had been tactical, but the exile was real. In The Hague, she moved through cold halls filled with cold intentions. The Dutch were polite but cautious. The French were sympathetic but unwilling. The Vatican sent blessings but no gold. Henrietta Maria, Queen of England, found herself pleading, not with words but with dignity. Every jewel pawned, every debt promised, every favor begged was a weight she bore without complaint. For every man who rolled his eyes at a woman speaking of war, there was a child in England bearing the name Stuart who would be executed if she failed. Back home, Charles was at war, not just with Parliament, but with his own people. The country had fractured into royalists and parliamentarians. Towns chose sides. Fathers and sons loaded muskets for opposite causes. Churches became barracks, and cathedrals rang not with hymns, but with the echo of drums. Yet the king, though outnumbered and poorly funded, believed in the sanctity of his cause. He believed in the anointing oil that once touched his head. And most of all, he believed in her, in Henrietta, who had promised to return not as a wife, but as a weapon. Her efforts bore fruit, but bitterly. With the help of loyal courtiers and sympathetic nobles, she gathered arms from the continent and arranged for their shipment back to royalist forces in the north of England. She boarded a ship bound for Yorkshire in early 1643, braving not just winter storms, but parliamentary warships. When she landed, it was not to royal fanfare, but to cannon fire. Parliament had declared her cargo treason. Her arrival was an act of war. Still, she pressed forward. She moved with her caravan of munitions through a landscape of fire and suspicion. Every village she passed had chosen a side, and not all chose hers. The Queen of England, dressed in black and mounted on horseback, passed through burned-out parishes like a ghost of power, surrounded by armed men and whispered curses. In some towns, the people wept at the sight of her. In others, they hissed. She kept her eyes forward. Her husband was waiting. By the time Henrietta rejoined Charles, England was already scarred. The Battle of Edgehill had ended indecisively, but blood had been spilled in royal name. The capital, London, remained firmly in the hands of Parliament. Charles had established his court in Oxford, a royal island in a hostile sea. Their reunion was quiet, shadowed by the realities of war. They were no longer a king and queen ruling a realm. They were fugitives in crowns. Still, the sight of her, alive, resolute, and armed, reignited his spirit. Charles saw in Henrietta not only his wife but his mirror. Both had been cast out. Both refused to bend. And yet, behind the mutual resolve lay a sorrow neither could fully voice. Their children were scattered, their allies dwindling. The England they once knew had become foreign land. Henrietta began to act more overtly as a political force. She urged Charles to be decisive, to cut through hesitation, to remove any who counseled appeasement. She saw compromise as surrender and surrender as sacrilege. She pressed him to pursue military gains, to capture London if possible, and to seek foreign alliances without shame. Her urgency was not misplaced. Parliament was growing bolder, bolstered by Scottish alliances and Puritan fervor. Every delay was a death. But Charles was still Charles, cautious to a fault, deliberate even when time was bleeding out. He struggled to unify his commanders. He hesitated over constitutional questions. He trusted generals who failed him. And as 1644 dawned, the tide began to turn irrevocably. The parliamentarian army, now under the discipline of the new model army, struck with increasing confidence. Henrietta, meanwhile, was pregnant once more and under threat. Oxford grew dangerous. The Queen could no longer remain. With a heavy heart, Charles sent her north toward Exeter and eventually back to France. She had arrived with gunpowder and courage. She departed with their unborn child and a heart shattered by the weight of war. The separation was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, irrevocable. Charles would never see her again. In France, Henrietta gave birth to a daughter, Henrietta Anne, in relative safety. But safety was cold comfort. She now lived as a queen without court, a mother without a family, a wife without her husband's touch. Letters passed between them, filled with longing, politics, and silent dread. Charles wrote of battles lost and hope preserved. She replied with prayers, advice, and appeals to keep faith. But beneath their words, the silence grew. Their love, though unbroken, now drifted across an ocean of violence. In the years that followed, Henrietta struggled to rally support for the royalist cause. The French court, though bound by blood, refused to entangle itself too deeply. The Pope offered spiritual consolation, but no soldiers. Even her own relatives began to view her cause as doomed. She visited convents, courtiers, and cardinals. She traded on every connection she had. But as the war in England dragged on, her power shrank. Her pleas became familiar. Her presence, once electrifying, was now an uncomfortable reminder of a lost world. Meanwhile, back in England, Charles's position deteriorated. Defeats mounted, castles fell, loyalists defected or died, and the parliamentarian grip tightened around his crown. In 1646, Charles surrendered himself not to Parliament, but to the Scottish army, gambling that his fellow monarchists would treat him with the respect due a king. They took his money, then sold him to his enemies. When Henrietta received word of his capture, she did not weep. She retreated to prayer. Her chambers became chapels. Her speech slowed. Her face thinned. In public, she remained dignified. In private, she began to tremble. She wrote to foreign rulers with a desperation she could barely mask. She even entertained the unthinkable, that her husband might be tried as a traitor, and yet she did not abandon him. She refused to believe that the world would allow the execution of a crowned king, an anointed man of God. She placed her faith not in muskets, but in the centuries of tradition that protected monarchy. She had forgotten, perhaps, that England had already forgotten its fear, that the people no longer whispered behind closed doors, but shouted in Parliament, that the Queen's faith in divine right was seen now not as virtue, but as delusion. And still, she waited. Alone in France, surrounded by courtiers who had already begun seeking patronage elsewhere, Henrietta Maria, Queen of England, mother of the future king, wife of the most hunted man in Europe, lit candles each night for a throne that no longer stood. Her fingers trembled over letters Charles could no longer answer. Her dreams became silent theaters of memory, the scent of England's reign, the hush of royal chapels, the weight of her crown. The war had ended, but her exile had only just begun. The war was over, but nothing had ended. England's fields were quiet now, but the quiet was not peace. It was aftermath. Armies disbanded, graves multiplied. And from across the sea, in the faded elegance of a borrowed French apartment, Henrietta Maria counted every silent day as a reminder that her war had not yet found its final wound. She no longer wore crowns or rode in gilded coaches. She moved instead through the hallways of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a queen in name and prayer only, her identity wrapped in veils and exile. Her daughter Henrietta Anne slept in the next room, unaware that the world she was born into no longer had a throne waiting for her. The once vibrant court Henrietta had tried to build in France now unraveled like thread. Servants were dismissed, friends drifted away, even her letters returned unopened. Yet she endured. Every sunrise became a ritual. Letters to ambassadors, messages to allies, fervent entreaties to bishops and cardinals, reminders to the French court that she was still Queen of England, even if no one said it aloud anymore. But each plea rang more hollow than the last. Europe had begun adjusting to a world without Charles. France, once her father's kingdom, now regarded her as a relic of a failed monarchy. The Vatican blessed her, but refused to arm her. Even her own family, bound by blood, offered only condolences, not cavalry. And in England, Charles was alone. He was no longer king-in-law, but in conviction. Captured, transferred, and held under guard, Charles lived under the illusion of negotiation. In letters to Henrietta, he wrote not of defeat, but of principles. He clung to the belief that compromise was possible, that Parliament would see reason, that his divine right would be recognized, even if not restored. Henrietta read his words with a growing ache in her chest. She understood what he could not admit. England had moved on. The parliamentarians no longer sought reform. They sought closure. They didn't want the king to change. They wanted the king to vanish. The months became a slow unspooling of dignity. Charles, once the monarch of 3 kingdoms, was shuffled from manor to fortress, his audiences limited, his conversations monitored. His letters to Henrietta, once warm and lyrical, became clipped, fatigued, increasingly abstract. Musings on suffering, justice, the will of God. And in reply, Henrietta wrote with faith as armor. She reminded him of his worth, of the divine order, of the history that had always favored kings who endured. But even her faith had begun to tremble. She could not save him. She had tried, through diplomacy, through arms, through exile, but the world had hardened against her, and with each passing day, the truth became more visible in the shadows of her candlelit chapel. England was preparing to kill her husband. In December 1648, Parliament purged itself of moderates, leaving only those who believed the king was beyond redemption. The trial was arranged in cold efficiency. Henrietta was not allowed to attend. No counsel of hers would be heard. Her letters were blocked, her voice silenced. She stood in France watching the architecture of vengeance rise like scaffolding over memory. When the sentence was pronounced, death by beheading, Henrietta collapsed. Not in the theatrical sense. She did not scream. She did not throw herself on the floor. She simply stopped speaking for 3 days. Those closest to her whispered prayers they were not sure she could hear. She would later say she had entered a different country in her mind, one where time did not move forward and love was untouched by verdicts, but time did move forward. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, Charles walked out onto the scaffold built in front of the banqueting house in Whitehall. The air was frozen, the sky gray. Thousands watched in silence. He wore 2 shirts, fearing the cold might make him shiver, and he didn't want anyone to think he was afraid. He spoke briefly, calmly, and laid his head upon the block with the dignity of a man convinced of righteousness. The axe fell. In France, Henrietta lit a single candle and knelt. She would remain kneeling for hours. She spoke no eulogy. She gave no interview. But the court, the servants, even her daughter, now old enough to ask what had happened, knew that something sacred had broken. Not just in the world, but in her. She did not attend a public funeral. There was no body to bury. Charles had been executed without ceremony, without sacred rites, without royal procession. The king had died like a criminal. Henrietta was left with silence. But grief is a strange thing. It does not always collapse a person. Sometimes it sharpens them. In the months that followed, Henrietta became something else. Neither widow nor queen, but a figure carved out of determination. Her mourning was not passive. She reorganized her household, resumed correspondence, and began pressing her eldest son Charles, now in hiding in the Netherlands, to prepare for the restoration of the crown. She had lost her king. She would not lose her dynasty, but her tools were blunted. France, despite the familial link, continued to offer only surface support. England's Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell solidified control with terrifying speed. Royalist uprisings were crushed. Allies were exiled, imprisoned, or executed. And Charles II, barely out of adolescence, lacked the stature or support to mount a serious return. Still, Henrietta persisted. She tried to arrange marriages for her children that might rebuild alliances. She drafted manifestos in exile, urging European monarchs to see the regicide as a warning to all sovereigns. She reminded them that if England could kill its king, no crown was truly safe. But the responses came slower now. Some didn't come at all. Time had become her enemy. Her face, once the subject of court portraits, grew thin and lined. Her hair, once jet black, grayed under a veil. She aged faster than the calendar, accelerated by sorrow and failure. The queen who had once ridden through Yorkshire with guns and purpose now spent her evenings reading the Psalms aloud to no one in particular. Her letters to Charles the Sioux became more anxious. She urged him to trust no one, to be cunning, to remember what they had lost. But beneath the words lay another message: survive. Even if you must compromise, even if you must hide your pride, just survive. Henrietta no longer dreamed of vengeance. She dreamed of continuity. She carried Charles's portrait everywhere. Sometimes she would set it on a window ledge and stare at it for hours. Visitors said they found her that way often, unmoving, as if listening to a conversation that had no sound. She once whispered to a nun that she still saw him in her dreams, not as he died, but as he was on their wedding night, clumsy and careful, trying not to show how lost he felt. It was that version of him, not the king, that she had loved most. And it was that version of him she had failed to protect. England had executed its king, but Henrietta Maria, in the quiet isolation of a foreign land, carried the heavier sentence. She had lived to watch the world forget. No queen prepares to become a widow, and no wife prepares to become a myth. When Henrietta Maria received the news of Charles's execution, it was not simply the loss of a husband. It was the shattering of a divine order she had believed in all her life. The king had died, but so had the illusion that monarchy was unbreakable, ordained, eternal. She had spent decades whispering prayers into power, placing her faith above politics, her marriage above all calculation. Now faith stood trial, and she was its last witness. France was not silent in the days that followed Charles's death, but it was indifferent in the way that empires are when blood is shed across someone else's borders. A few candles were lit, a mass was said, there were murmured condemnations in courtly French. But then the court moved on. Henrietta did not. She withdrew not into grief, but into a kind of militant sanctity. Her mourning was not passive, it became doctrine. She transformed her rooms into chapels, her routines into rituals, her conversations into confessions. There were no longer courtiers around her, only those willing to speak in the language of suffering. Her letters to allies became more pointed, almost prophetic. She no longer begged for support. She warned of the chaos that would follow if thrones could fall so easily. But few were listening. In the wake of the regicide, Europe was stunned but cautious. The beheading of Charles had sent shockwaves through every royal court on the continent, but it had also served as a reminder that the world was changing. Monarchy was no longer sacred. Kings could die in public. Queens could live on in exile, powerless. Yet Henrietta refused to accept exile as her ending. Her focus turned swiftly, fiercely, to her son. Charles II was now the legitimate heir, even if he had no crown to prove it. She poured herself into his cause, molding him not just into a prince, but into a symbol. Her letters to him were urgent, demanding, sometimes harsh. She told him to harden, to wait, to charm when needed, to vanish when necessary. She taught him not to imitate his father's dignity, but to learn from his failure to bend. Faith was no longer enough. Strategy was survival. But Henrietta's own strategy had begun to fray. In her relentless devotion, she alienated even those closest to her. Her insistence on Charles's divine right made some foreign rulers nervous. Her open Catholicism limited the scope of her appeal. Even her own son began to pull away, weary of her intensity, resentful of her insistence that every decision he made was not his own, but a legacy of his father's sacrifice. Still, she pressed on. She met with Jesuit advisors and drafted manifestos. She attempted to broker deals with the Vatican. She sought favor at the French court through her family ties, But the regency under Cardinal Mazarin remained cold, focused on internal stability. England's turmoil was seen as dangerous contagion, not a noble tragedy. Henrietta was a living reminder of instability. No one wanted to catch her fire. Meanwhile, England had changed form entirely. Under Oliver Cromwell, the monarchy had been replaced with the Commonwealth. It was not democracy, it was not peace. It was, in many ways, a quieter form of authoritarianism, cloaked in religious zeal and military precision. The people were no freer. The war had ended only to give birth to a republic of suspicion and silence. From across the sea, Henrietta watched reports come in, of royalists executed, of Anglican bishops exiled, of her husband's memory being erased. Stained glass was smashed, statues pulled down. The Book of Common Prayer, once sacred to the king, was banned. Even Charles's private letters were leaked and dissected, stripped of poetry and made into propaganda. The image of Charles, the steadfast martyr, the solemn sovereign, was being recast as the tyrant who brought war. Henrietta fought back the only way she could. She published her own versions of the truth. She had Charles's final letters printed and distributed. She encouraged poets and priests to speak of him as a saint. She invoked the language of martyrdom, calling him King Charles the Blessed, and leaned fully into the idea that his death was a holy sacrifice. It was no longer just politics, it was liturgy. But deep within her, something fragile began to bend. For all her efforts, she could not control the growing irrelevance. Royalist sympathizers in England grew quieter. Some went into hiding, others simply moved on. Even her surviving children, scattered across Europe, began forging lives that did not revolve around her grief. Henrietta's youngest son, Henry, was taken by the Commonwealth and raised under Protestant guardianship. Her daughter Elizabeth died in captivity, a prisoner in name but in truth, a child abandoned by history. The losses mounted, not in dramatic bursts, but in cold silences that never resolve. In her prayers, Henrietta began to wonder, not if God existed, but if he had stopped listening. She questioned not her husband's righteousness, but the point of it. What was gained by his refusal to compromise? Would England have spared him if he had yielded sooner? Had her own counsel, unyielding, proud, pushed him too far? These thoughts came at night, in the spaces between rosaries, in the pauses between pages of psalms. She never said them aloud, but she began to dream of a different life, one where she had not married Charles, one where she had remained in France, untouched by English suspicion, one where her children had grown without the weight of a broken crown. But dawn always came, and with it, duty. She resumed her campaign for her son's restoration, not because she believed it would happen, but because she could not imagine doing anything else. She lived now as an embodiment of cause. Without that, there was nothing. And then, a shift. In 1651, Charles II made a desperate bid to reclaim his throne. He landed in Scotland, rallied a small army, and marched south. Henrietta held her breath with every report. For a moment, it seemed like resurrection, but the Battle of Worcester ended it. Charles II was defeated, forced into hiding, smuggled across England disguised as a peasant. When Henrietta received word of his escape, she laughed, not with joy, but with disbelief. Her son had survived, but the throne had slipped further away than ever. Her health began to fail. She developed tremors in her hands. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, grew faint. Yet she still attended Mass daily, still lit candles, still wrote letters she knew would be ignored. Her exile had become her vocation, her husband's death, her scripture. One evening, a young nun asked her if she regretted anything. Henrietta did not answer immediately. She touched the edge of a crucifix and looked at the fading light on the chapel walls. If she regretted anything, it was that she had loved a man more than she loved safety, but it was not a regret she would ever speak aloud. The moment the axe fell on Charles, time did not stop. It recoiled. Across the English Channel, in the quiet hush of her private chapel in France, Henrietta Maria knelt beneath the crucifix and waited for something to break. But nothing did. The candles flickered. The wood groaned. Her breath shuddered but did not fail. She had prepared for this day not in weeks but in years. Still, when it came, it did not feel like martyrdom. It felt like disappearance. He had gone where she could not follow, and now she was left not as a queen, not even as a widow, but as a relic of a world that had dismantled itself. For a time, Henrietta moved through the corridors of Saint-Germain-en-Laye like a ghost in her own body. Courtiers whispered her name with averted eyes. Some said she had not spoken for days. Others said she spoke only in Latin now, as though language itself had abandoned its usefulness. She no longer hosted salons or wrote directives. She simply walked, slowly, always in black, as though navigating through a fog only she could see. What few understood was that the silence was not surrender. It was structure. Henrietta had spent her life in noise, public scrutiny, courtly demands, political venom. Now she chose the quiet. Her grief was not performative. It was strategic. She was conserving something, holding tightly to the last unbroken piece of herself. Memory. In England, the machinery of erasure began its work. The monarchy had not just been decapitated, it was being dismantled piece by piece. Charles's face was scraped off coins, his name removed from prayers, his portrait slashed or burned, his writings mocked as the babblings of a tyrant. The parliamentarian regime under Cromwell did not merely want to defeat the crown, it wanted to make it unthinkable. But Henrietta remembered, and in her remembrance, she resisted. She began collecting the fragments, letters Charles had written in captivity, the final speeches he had prepared, the testimony of those who had seen him walk to his death with unflinching calm. She commissioned prints of his final portrait, the one painted just before the execution, where he looked not afraid, but transcendent. She began to shape the narrative, not of a fallen king, but of a martyred one. He would not be forgotten if she had breath left in her lungs. Yet breath came more heavily now. She coughed in the mornings. Her hands trembled when lifting the chalice during Mass. The doctors said it was the climate, or her nerves, or sorrow compacted into flesh. Whatever the cause, she began to shrink into herself. Her letters became shorter, her visitors fewer. She allowed only the most loyal, those who still believed in the royalist cause, or at least in her. Even her children were distant now. Charles II, ever the pragmatist, had taken her counsel when convenient and ignored it when not. He spent his exile moving from one uncertain host to another, The Hague, Cologne, Paris, charming, bargaining, always maneuvering. Henrietta admired his survival, but not his ambiguity. He had learned the lesson she could not teach. Sometimes to regain a throne, one must first pretend not to care if it returns. But Henrietta cared, every day. She wrote prayers in the margins of old books. She recited litanies under her breath when she walked. She kept Charles's rosary beneath her pillow, even though she rarely slept. She marked the anniversary of his death not with public mourning, but with an all-night vigil alone. When servants asked what she needed, she said only, time. But time, always indifferent, offered her only reminders. She had become a queen without a court, a mother without her children, a symbol no one wanted to carry. The French court had grown weary of her presence. Her glory had long since dried up. Her brother Louis XIII was dead. The court of Mazarin and Anne of Austria tolerated her with stiff courtesy, but offered little in substance. She had outlived her utility. So she moved again, from Saint-Germain to Cologne, a modest house outside Paris where she could live with dignity, if not power. The estate was quiet, almost monastic. There were gardens that bloomed in springs and fog that settled over the rooftops in autumn. It was not a palace, but it was enough. Here Henrietta began the slow work of disappearing on her own terms. She wrote fewer letters. She refused most invitations. Her days followed a rhythm of prayer, reflection, and memory. The staff were reduced to a handful. She allowed portraits of Charles to remain on the walls, even though they unnerved visitors. She insisted they stay. He was the axis around which her life had turned. Removing him would collapse everything. And yet, she did not collapse. There were moments, rare but piercing, when she felt something like peace. A garden walk in spring when the wind reminded her of her childhood in Fontainebleau. A letter from Charles II, more respectful than usual. A visit from her daughter Henrietta Anne, now blooming into womanhood. whose laughter briefly resurrected something long buried. In those moments, she almost allowed herself to believe that legacy might outlive pain. But the ache returned quickly. She watched from a distance as England carried on without her. Cromwell ruled not as king, but as something more terrifying, a commoner who wielded royal power without royal restraint. The Puritans reshaped culture, shuttered theaters, punished joy. In a strange way, it vindicated her. The world they built in opposition to her husband was colder than anything Charles had imagined. Still, Henrietta felt no triumph, only absence. The days shortened. Her body weakened. The walks in the garden grew shorter. The cough deepened. The fire in her room became a second sun. In her final winter, she began waking in the middle of the night, unable to remember where she was. The walls shifted. The faces blurred. Sometimes she called out to Charles. Other times she simply sat in silence, hands folded, waiting for the dawn. And then, without ceremony, she slipped away. It was 1669. She died not in a palace, but in a quiet bed in Cologne, surrounded not by ambassadors and bishops, but by nuns and shadows. Her passing made little noise in France. In England, it was acknowledged with cool formality. There was no procession, no mourning bells, only a notation in the records of Europe's fading monarchies. Henrietta Maria, widow of Charles, has died. But in the stillness of that cold room, something deeper passed. She had lived through two kingdoms, one war, a husband's execution, a nation's betrayal, and the long silence that follows history when no one is left to listen. She had loved a king more than safety and a crown more than comfort. And in the end, she had loved memory itself, until memory was all that remained. Death, though final, did not end Henrietta Maria's story. In fact, it was not even hers. Long before her final breath in the quiet chambers of Cologne, long before the roses in her garden bloomed for the last time, the past had begun to stir. In 1660, just 9 years before her death, something unthinkable happened. Her exiled son, Charles II, returned to England, not as a fugitive, but as a king. It should have been triumph. It should have been vindication. It should have been the moment when Henrietta's long years of suffering resolved into something glorious. But when the restoration came, it came without her. Charles had made his way back not on a wave of grief, but on a tide of political exhaustion. After the death of Oliver Cromwell and the collapse of the Commonwealth, England, worn down by austerity, by censorship, by joyless piety, wanted not justice but color. It wanted music again, theater again, indulgence again. It wanted something to believe in. And Charles, charming, elegant, irreverent, was better than a god. He was human. The monarchy was not restored because it was missed. It was restored because it was useful. Henrietta received the news not with jubilation, but with something harder to name. Her face did not soften. Her eyes did not brighten. Instead, she bowed her head and whispered a prayer. Not for victory, but for caution. She had waited for this moment for over a decade, but the version of it that arrived was unfamiliar. She wrote to Charles II, as a mother does, with pride veiled in instruction. She congratulated him. She reminded him to govern wisely. She hinted that perhaps now, after all they had endured, she could return. But no invitation came, not right away. Charles had his reasons. The court he had inherited was fragile. Tension still lingered. Memories of civil war clung to the walls. His advisors whispered that the return of the Catholic Queen Mother, the very symbol of division for so many, would awaken old ghosts. For now, they said, it was best to keep her at a distance. So Henrietta waited. Months passed. Then at last a letter arrived. Charles invited her to England. But it was not a command, it was permission. And so in the late summer of 1660, Henrietta Maria returned to the country that had once crowned her and later murdered her husband. She stepped off the ship not in royal splendor, but in veiled modesty. Her body was frail, her voice soft. Her presence, once so politically explosive, was now simply awkward. England did not cheer. The court received her with courtesy, but not warmth. Her rooms were smaller, her staff fewer, her influence non-existent. The young men who now shaped policy, men who had grown up in the shadow of war, looked at her not with awe, but with calculation. She was a memory, a question mark, a risk. Even Charles, though kind, kept a careful distance. He entertained her at court. He walked with her in the gardens. He spoke of family, of legacy, of God, but he did not consult her. He did not ask what she had endured. He did not inquire about the long years in exile when she had scraped together every ounce of power to protect his name. Henrietta understood, and she said nothing. Instead, she visited the old places. Whitehall, where she had once laughed with Charles. St. James's, where she had prayed in secret, clutching rosary beads as men shouted her name in hatred beyond the gates. Hampton Court, where her children had run through the halls before war took everything. Every room whispered at her. Every corridor led back to a life no one else remembered. But the England she had returned to was not the England she had left. It was louder, more cynical, more theatrical. Religion, once the battlefield, had become background music. Parliament had more power, the people had more demands, and the king, her son, ruled less by right than by charm. He smiled where his father had stood still. He joked where his father had prayed, and Henrietta saw it all, not with disapproval, but with distance. Her role now was ceremonial. She attended court events. She posed for portraits. She dined with foreign dignitaries. But her days of influence were gone, and deep inside she knew that her presence unsettled more than it soothed. Every time she entered a room, she brought with her the memory of another reign. A reign that ended on a wooden scaffold stained with blood. She stayed only a year. In 1661, citing her health and a desire for quiet, she returned to France, this time not as an exile, but as a stranger to both countries that had defined her. England had moved on, France had forgotten, and she, once the queen of three kingdoms, now sought peace not in power, but in prayer. At Colombes, she built a small chapel, simple, humble. She spent her final years in meditation, writing letters that were more like testimonies than correspondence. She no longer campaigned. She no longer fought, but she watched. She watched as Charles II transformed the monarchy into theater. She watched as her daughter Henrietta Anne married into the French court, stepping into a world she herself had once left behind. She watched as the memory of her husband became less man, more symbol. Sometimes she walked in the gardens barefoot, trailing her hand along the hedges. The servants would whisper that on those days, she looked not like a queen, but like someone haunting the grounds of a life unfinished. One autumn morning, she told a visiting priest that she no longer feared death. Death, she said, is not the enemy. Oblivion is. And in that phrase lay the tragedy of Henrietta Maria. She had given everything, her homeland, her health, her youth, her children, for a crown that shattered. She had stood beside a king as he defied history and died for it. She had fought for a future that arrived too late for her to live inside it. And when that future finally opened its gates, it had no room for the woman who built the path to it. She had returned to England, but it was not her home anymore, and it never would be again. History often buries its architects. It builds monuments to kings and writes ballads for wars, but it rarely leaves room for the ones who whispered behind thrones, who lit candles in the dark while crowns were cracking. Henrietta Maria died in silence, in a chapel she built with the remnants of her hope, and in doing so, she joined a category of legacy that defies inscription. She became memory without monument. It was July of 1669 when her heart gave out. The physician called it age. The priest called it peace. But those who had known her, truly known her, understood that she had been dying for years, not of sickness, but of stillness, of having lived too long past the story that had given her shape. There was no grand funeral. Her body was taken to the Basilica of Saint Denis, among the bones of French royalty who had long forgotten she once bore their name. In England, the court acknowledged her death in a handful of sentences. Her son Charles II did not weep in public. He hosted a masque that week, a glittering affair of dancers, satin, and subtle satire. The nation she had once tried to save did not ring its bells. The press barely mentioned her. Time had done what war could not. It had erased her. But the erasure was never complete. Because some memories do not vanish. They settle, like dust on altar cloths, like the flicker of candlelight in an empty chapel. And if one looks closely, between the pages of lost letters, in the corners of cracked oil paintings, in the margins of history books, Henrietta Maria is still there. She is there in the ghost of a chapel that once stood in Whitehall, where she prayed beneath stained glass imported from France, hands folded while crowds outside chanted for her exile. She is there in the voice of Charles as he walked to his death, serene not because he had no fear, but because someone had taught him how to wear dignity like armor. She is there in the exile of Charles II, in the softness he learned to weaponize, in the irony he used to disarm his enemies, traits not inherited from a father who ruled with stone, but from a mother who survived with fire beneath silk. She is there in the name of a colony across the sea, in a land she never saw but which bore her legacy anyway. Maryland, named for the Catholic Queen of England, a quiet nod across oceans and centuries. And she is there in the silence that followed the axe. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of understanding. That to love power is to dance with its ghosts. That to believe in divine right is to watch the world try to kill it. That to stand beside a man the world calls tyrant is to choose loyalty over legacy and bear the weight of both. Henrietta Maria was never what they said she was. She was not the serpent they painted in Puritan pamphlets. She was not the foreign threat cloaked in incense and conspiracy. She was not the soft woman who whispered her husband into ruin. Nor was she the saint some later royalists tried to carve from her bones. She was harder than all of them, and more fragile. She was a queen who had no homeland, a wife who buried her husband without a grave, a mother who outlived her children's innocence, a Catholic in a Protestant war, a foreigner in every place she ever lived. And in that contradiction, she became something rarer than a ruler. She became a lens. Through her, we see the tragedy of absolutism, the cost of loyalty, the unbearable weight of legacy worn by those never meant to carry it. In the end, no statue was built for her. No epic poem penned her name in gold. But somewhere, in a cold chapel lit by only one candle, her story lingers. She kneels still, in the minds of those who remember, not in royal robes, but in black lace, hands folded, eyes closed, lips parting in prayer, not for salvation, but for understanding. And in that final image lies the paradox that defines her. She gave her life to a crown. She gave her soul to a king. But it was history that forgot her, and perhaps that was her last act of power, to vanish so completely that only by seeking the silence can we hear her voice.